Under the Fugitive Slave Law, the federal government could be called on to solve disputes about slavery, and we saw that in the movie we watched, Harriet. People in the North had to return the runaway slaves. So instead of helping slaves that were running away, if they got caught assisting them, they'd get arrested. So some people would actually turn over the runaway slaves now. According to the law, all that had to happen was the slave owner had to provide some kind of proof that this person was a runaway slave. And we didn't have photo IDs back then. We didn't have, social security numbers. So there was lots of occasions where innocent people, freed African Americans, were taken back into slavery because someone else claimed they were a slave. The slave owners thought this law was fair. They thought they were going after their property. And some people in the North chose to ignore this law completely, like the abolitionists. And we saw some of that in the movie we watched. There was people actually going out of their way to help these slaves escape freedom. They realized how bad slavery truly was. And one of the main ways that the slaves would escape was using the Underground Railroad. And contrary to the name, it's not a railroad. It's not like a subway. This is basically a secret network of safe houses and people who will help these runaways. So it was dangerous for a slave to try to escape into freedom. Slaves that would run would oftentimes be severely punished and, mutilated. They would have their Achilles tendons cut, and they would be punished if they were caught. So this was a dangerous thing to do. So it was dangerous for the slaves to try to escape, and it was also dangerous for the people trying to help them. But one of the main ways they would travel is they would run during the night when there was cover, and then during the day they would hide at these places called stations, and they would get help from conductors. And those were basically the people on the Underground Railroad who were helping the runaway slaves escape to freedom. There's multiple different people who were involved with it. It was a giant network. There's Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. So lots of people were working to try to fight against this injustice. So how does cotton still control the nation? The main thing about cotton is the profit the South is making off of it. And after the cotton gin was invented, their profit was multiplied 10 times what they were making before. So they're making a ton of money off of it, and they do not want to give it up. So cotton is making up about 50% of American exports. So about half of the money coming into America is from cotton and cotton products. So the South was really tied to the cotton industry. That's how pretty much all the money's being made in the South, except for small, farmers who don't have enough resources to grow cotton. The rich plantation owners basically control everything, and they control the government as well. They have enough money to make sure their people are getting elected and reelected. They closed themselves off to the rest of the country, and they kind of separated themselves and isolated themselves because they were stuck in this way of life. They thought that anybody trying to take away slavery was personally attacking them, and for some reason they refused to acknowledge how terrible it was to actually own another person. Most people in the South did not have slaves. So the average person is not going to have slaves, but these giant plantation owners, they're going to have 20, 30, 40 slaves sometimes. So most of the people in the South working on their small farms are doing their own work, but the large plantation owners, they're the ones who own most of the slaves. But a lot of people in the South, even if they don't own slaves, don't think slavery is wrong. They considered slavery to be good for the slaves and the plantation owners. And we talked about this in the last lesson. That just isn't the case. If slavery was a good deal, there would have been white people signing up to be slaves too. So it's not a good deal. So, next election. Franklin Pierce, a Democrat from New Hampshire, became the president in 1853. And even though Franklin Pierce was from the North, he really wasn't against slavery. He chose a guy named Jefferson Davis to be his Secretary of War. And Jefferson Davis is going to become important a little bit later in a chapter or two. Under President Pierce, Jefferson Davis sent a guy named James Gadsden to Mexico to try to work out a purchase for a new chunk of land. So remember, in the previous chapters, we fought with Mexico over Texas and California. So what happens? This guy, James Gadsden, goes to Mexico, and he's trying to work out a deal for New Mexico and Arizona for about $10 billion. This land becomes known as the Gadsden Purchase, And it becomes important because when we buy this land, we now have enough property to make a railroad that will connect the East Coast and the West Coast of the country. Okay, so the population of California is growing very quickly. Remember, in 48, they found the gold there and started the gold rush, and California's population was multiplied by 10 times. Traveling there was not easy, though. If you remember that video clip we watched about George Donner, traveling was very dangerous. There was no rest stops, there was no motels, and if you got stranded, it was on you. Like, you had to figure out a way to survive. Many towns and cities were connected by railroads, and the farmers would use these railroads to ship their products and sell their goods. Railroads are safer than traveling by wagon, and they are quicker. So railroads are the quickest way to travel back then. But the problem is, railroads aren't built everywhere yet. You have to build the railroad to be able to use it. So Congress is talking about building a new railroad, and they're discussing a couple of different routes. Chicago to Oregon, Chicago to St. Louis to San Francisco, New Orleans to San Diego, Memphis to Los Angeles. But Congress cannot agree. The Southerners want to build the railroad mainly in the South. Northerners do not want the railroad being built mainly in the South because they are afraid that it will allow slavery to spread even farther. So a guy named Stephen Douglas, he's from the North. He wants to build the railroad from St. Louis or Chicago to California. But the problem with this plan is it's going to have to go through Nebraska, and Nebraska is not officially a state yet. So Stephen Douglas tries to come up with a plan to figure out how he can build this railroad through Nebraska if Nebraska is not technically a state. So if you guys remember, a few chapters ago, we looked at a map that had the Missouri Compromise on it. It had a line drawn across. Everything below it could be a slave state. Everything above it had to be a free state. And Stephen Douglas is going to say, you know what? Maybe it's time to get rid of that map. So Stephen Douglas suggests getting rid of the Missouri Compromise. He wants to repeal it, and he wants to let Kansas and Nebraska both become states. And his idea is something called popular sovereignty. And what that means is that the states themselves would get to decide if they wanted slavery or not. So he's basically saying, forget that map we drew, and we'll let the people who live in Kansas and Nebraska vote to see if they want to be a slave state or a free state. So this causes lots of tension because many people in Congress in the North do not want slavery to spread, and people in the South want to keep slavery. So what happens? A group of Free Soil Party members, Northern Whigs and Democrats, start a new political party called the Republican Party. And their main issue is that nobody is taking a clear stance on slavery, and they want to take a clear stand on it. So they also wanted to repeal the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they wanted to keep the Missouri Compromise, and they wanted to repeal or get rid of the Fugitive Slave Law. Okay guys, so they finished up that chapter, so I need you to go into Google Classroom and open up chapter 14, lesson 2 and 3.